Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to take a look at Prisma, which is marketed as the next generation Node.JS ORM. It claims to help developers to build faster and make fewer mistakes when working with databases. Today I kind of want to take a look at what Prisma is, and I have not actually used Prisma before, so this is going to be a total first impressions. We're going to test how easy is it to get started, is the documentation good, and we're going to try to build an API with it, a simple REST API, and we're going to take a look at, how does it compare if we were to build that same API and other ORMs. What exactly is it about Prisma that makes it next generation? So that's what I want to take a look at and explore. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and get started here. Let's take a look at some of the features that Prisma has at a high level. It claims that it has a data model that you can easily read. They have this sort of schema syntax. It's very similar to something like GraphQL, if you've ever used that before. They claim to have a type-safe database client, which is definitely something you want to have when you're writing stuff in TypeScript. They also have their own way of doing migrations, which we'll hopefully take a look at in this video. And then they even have their own visual database browser. So instead of you using something like dbeaver or db visualizer or something similar, you'll just use their own UI, which again, I want to take a look at how this performs. You'll also notice on their homepage that they claim that they're very much something that plays well with any framework. If you're subscribed to my channel, you know that I'm a huge fan of NestJS. So we're going to try and see, does it play well with NestJS? We'll try to make an API with that. By the way, it's also worth mentioning that they have this Prisma examples repo that has examples for pretty much almost any of the big frameworks that you can think of. So if you're trying to use it with Happy, Express, NestJS, GraphQL, there's so many examples here that, if you didn't like that I used NestJS for this video, maybe you want to try it with your own framework of choice. There's so many examples in here for you to take a look at. All right, finally, let's jump into the code. I've got a terminal here. I'm going to use the Nest CLI to create a new application, and I'm just going to call that Try Prisma. Now, this video is obviously not about teaching NestJS. I have a lot of content on NestJS in my channel. If you want to learn more on how to get started, I have a crash course. I even have one with other ORMs like TypeORM if you're interested. But in this video, we're just going to take a look at how well does it actually integrate with your framework of choice, which mine happens to be NestJS. All right, so I now have my code open here in VS Code. And first thing I'm going to do is create. All right, now I have my NestJS code open in VS Code. So first, let's talk about what are we going to try and build. So I was thinking that we can try to build a simple CRUD API with a little bit of relationships. So perhaps we could do a library API where we have a catalog of books and books have authors. So you can probably kind of imagine the schema for that, where you have books and authors can have one too many books. And then if we have time, we'll add a little bit more to that. But the API itself ideally is that we can do a CRUD of books and authors. So let's go ahead and again use the Nest CLI to generate some stuff for us so we can get up and running quickly. I'm going to do nest generate resource, and it's going to ask me what would I like my resource to be called. Let's start with books. And I'm going to use REST API here as a transport layer and auto-generate the CRUD endpoints. So it's going to do that, install a couple of packages, and then we'll be good to go. So let's take a look at what we generated. We got a books module and folder here, and it has a controller. If we open up that books controller, you'll notice that it just has your typical CRUD endpoints. So we've got our create, read, update, delete, and then it has this service that you'll notice has those methods built into it, but they're not actually implemented yet. They're just returning strings. So our goal here is to get this service to actually talk to a database using Prisma, right? So we need to be able to create books, find books, update books, delete books, and so on. So back in the Prisma documentation, they do have some docs here on how to get started, whether you're starting from scratch or adding to an existing project. And taking a look at the starting from scratch, it'll ask you, do you want to do relational or MongoDB? So that's actually interesting. I didn't know that it would work with MongoDB as well, but we'll take a look at that maybe at another time. So let's go to relational databases, and it goes through some of the things that you need to get started with. And taking a look at this, their documentation is actually pretty cool because you can switch between TypeScript with JavaScript and whatever database you're using, so it'll actually guide you based on your own selection. So that's pretty cool. It's sort of like a choose your own adventure. What was a little bit odd to me, like taking a look at this, was they didn't have SQLite here, which is something I like to use in tutorials because it's so easy to set up. So I was kind of hoping to see that. And then you'll notice that when they do project setup, it has you install all of these other things like TypeScript and stuff, which you may or may not already have. For example, with Nest, it already comes with a lot of these TypeScript dependencies. But luckily, NestJS, and well, big reason why I like NestJS is they have fantastic documentation. In fact, they have documentation on Prisma, and even better, it's on SQLite. So we're gonna take a look at following this guide and see what we can come up with. So it says that first steps is you create your NestJS project, which we already did, and the next step is to set up Prisma. So with the documentation and the code side by side here, we're gonna go ahead and run this npm install Prisma -- save dev. And it actually says here that we're going to use the Prisma CLI and that we're going to start with the npx prisma init command. So we're going to go ahead and do exactly that, npx prisma init. And let's take a look at what this generated for us. It says that my schema was generated in a Prisma folder. We'll take a look at that in a second. And next steps is to set a database URL, set the provider for that database, run Prisma DB poll to turn your database schema into a Prisma schema, and then generate the client. So let's try to work through some of those steps. First, let's look at the schema. And actually, you'll notice that I don't have any syntax highlighting here, and VS Code is recommending to search the marketplace. Let's go ahead and do that. So there is a Prisma syntax highlighting extension here. I'm going to go ahead and install that. And voila, we've got syntax highlighting for our schema. All right, so according to the documentation here, it actually also created a .env file for us, which is likely where you'll be putting database credentials, which makes a lot of sense. So you'll notice there's actually a database URL in here, and I noticed that that's referenced in the schema. So that's one thing to learn right away, is that you can reference environment variables, I guess, using this env function. It also tells me that Postgres is the default, as we can see in the database URL, as well as the provider here. And we want to use SQLite like we mentioned. So we'll actually just follow this documentation. So it says that I need to change the provider to SQLite and update my database URL to a file like this. I'll just go ahead and copy and paste that. Now, what I'm curious about is if I'm supposed to be installing SQLite myself, which usually you should, but I'm not sure if Prisma maybe automatically will install it for me later. So we'll see if we run into any errors. But let's go ahead and just follow through this documentation to create our first schema and run some migrations. So our first step is to create some kind of schema, or at least there's already a schema here, but we need to add to it. And remember, we talked about creating a bookstore or library API. So we're going to try and create a book model. They have some examples here with a post and user, which will be pretty similar to what we're trying to do, where we have books and authors. But I want to take it one step at a time by first starting with the model for a book. And let's just see if we can create the CRUD for that. So I'm going to go ahead and actually copy this model for a post and manipulate it to work for a book. So we'll remove this author field for now because I want to see what the migration is like later on when I'm actually gonna go ahead and add that. And we're just gonna keep it simple, and we're just gonna have perhaps an ID and a title, and we'll have an auto incrementing ID. That's fine to get started with. Definitely want to explore how to do UUIDs later, but I think this is fine as a start. All right, it says that once we have the models in place, or at least I have one, run a migration command using the Prisma CLI. So we're going to do that. All right, so in the terminal, I'm going to do npx prisma migrate dev -- name, and I'm going to call it add books. And what does that do? So it says my SQLite database was created, and it made some migration files. So we're gonna take a look at that. So it looks like it generated SQL for us. It says your database is now in sync with your schema. So that means it not only generated the SQL, but I think it also ran that. And apparently it created a Prisma client for us, which I assume is what we're going to use to query the database. So let's kind of explore some of that one at a time. It says that there's a new migration folder here, and there's this file. Let's take a look at the generated SQL. It did a create table post with the ID and title, which is wrong. Actually, I said that I wanted books. So what do I do here? Do I just rerun the migration and it'll fix it for me? That's what we're gonna find out. So I'm gonna do npx prisma migrate div add book again. So it actually just creates a new migration, and it dropped my table of post and created my books table. So that's pretty cool. So that's actually a really good quick test of migrations working, right? You're ideally able to take your database from nothing to incrementally improve it to your ideal schema. So that's actually a really cool thing to notice, is that as you manipulated the schema file and run the migrations, it's automatically gonna add and remove columns and tables. And I'm curious to see how that's going to look as well when we add relationships to authors in a little bit. But again, let's start simple here. All right, so now we have a basic books table, and we want to do CRUD operations off of that. And the documentation at this point tells me that I need to install and create a Prisma client, which I think is what we're going to use to query. So npm install at prisma /client. That's good to go. So according to the documentation here, it says that as the client installs, it automatically runs Prisma generate, which what that does is that it reads your Prisma schema and updates the generated client inside Node modules. So it does also mention that in the future, as you change your schema, you'll need to run that generate every time. So I'll be curious to see how painful that would be as you're developing. How often do you need to remember to rerun generate? So that's a good quick note to know about. All right, so at this point, with the client installed and generated, it sounds like the next thing we need to do is create a service. From NestJS's perspective, we need to use this service to sort of hook onto that client, and this is what we're going to use to inject it into our services and controllers. So I'm going to copy this code. And it tells me that I should create that in the src directory in a file name called prisma.service.ts. So I'll do exactly that in src. We're going to do new file prisma.service.ts. And I'm going to paste in that code. Oddly enough, this code has an import in here that's not used. So I'm not sure what's that about. And according to the documentation, we don't really need to care too much about the code in here. I don't think it's going to change that often. It does seem like, it has a little bit of configurability, like what do you do on module init, which in this case, it connects to our database, I assume. So where we go from here is we want to inject this Prisma service into our book service and actually start creating queries. So as you might know, in NestJS, a lot of it is driven by dependency injection. So we're going to add a constructor here, and we're going to do private Prisma service. And we'll make sure to import Prisma service from that file that we just created. All right, from here, I think we just need to learn how to do basic CRUD queries. And just so you know what I'm taking a look at, there is this documentation in Prisma specifically for CRUD, right? How do you do create, read, update, delete? We'd probably start with read. How do we read data? And then in addition to that, the examples in NestJS also show a lot of these CRUD examples. So those are the two references that I'll be using in this video, right? So why don't we go ahead and just kind of use that reference and see what we can come up with here. So let's maybe just start with, a basic select all. How do we do that? So I assume this at Prisma dot, and it looks like from here I need to select the model, I guess. So in this case, that's books. And then there is, according to the documentation, a bunch of find methods. So we got find many, find unique. We'll use find many. And find unique, I believe, is what we'll use for find one here in just a second. Which actually, why don't we just do that right now? Let's do this. That Prisma books that find unique. And what I actually need to pass in here is sort of like a where clause, where I'm going to do where ID is ID. All right, so that's pretty simple. And as you can see, it did sort of generate the client off of our schema. So it's aware of books because it took a look at our schema and generated a client off of that. So let's actually run our application for the first time and see, can we query the books table, which really it's empty, right? So we're not gonna get anything, but let's just at least run it and see, can we get an empty array? So I'm running npm start dev here. So immediately I'm running into a problem here where it actually can't find a Prisma service, which I kind of expected this to pop up, which is why I was curious why it wasn't mentioned in the documentation that it needs to be an import in one of the modules. All right, so let's try to fix that problem by adding our Prisma service to perhaps the books module. I believe it really should be an additional provider here. Prisma service. And taking a look at the logs, we can see that we've got green here. It's no longer erroring, so we should be good to go. All right, so let's test our API. I should be able to go to Thunder client over here, which is a lot like Postman if you've never used it before. And I should be able to make a call to localhost 3000. And you'll notice that we get our hello world. That's what our base API is doing. But we also added a books CRUD API. So we should be able to do a get on /books, which is going to return us our empty array. So I think that means it's querying our database, right? It's not running into any errors. So let's actually go in and try to create a new book. But first, we're going to need to implement the create method in book service, right? We have a create DTO coming in here. All right, so let's implement this. First of all, we have some kind of input, and you'll notice in NestJS, typically there is a DTO class, right? That has that represents that request body. So in typical NestJS, you would define the properties in here using, you'd add ID, number, title, string, so that you have a representation of that shape in NestJS. But something that I actually just discovered as I'm reading the documentation here is that you don't have to do that manually anymore. It looks like part of the type definition that Prisma generates for you is those DTO shapes. So I can actually replace this with Prisma, the name of your model, which in my case is books. And then you'll notice there's a bunch of like different things in here. And there's one called books create input. If we drill down into this type, you'll notice that there is this type definition for a books create input, which is just a title string, which is exactly what we want for a create DTO, which is pretty cool. So that means you don't have to define DTOs anymore, as far as I can tell. Now I'm curious though how you're supposed to do validation, which in NestJS DTOs usually you'd use class validator, but we'll explore that in a little bit. So if we have this DTO, according to the documentation, to create that, I again just do prisma.books, and then there is a create method. I just pass in the DTO like this, and I believe that's all we need to do. And you'll notice that the data already has that type. So even if I remove that DTO, it's going to tell me that I have the wrong shape in here because it's expecting a books create input. So it's expecting this type specifically. So that's pretty nice. Now, if you're curious and maybe you were using Prisma for a JavaScript app, not TypeScript, you can actually just provide the DTO as an object like this. So if you're doing this in Express, that's probably how you do it. Also, looking at this create documentation, it does link to generated types. So it has this documentation for advanced type safety. So I think that's a lot of the thing we just discovered here is these generated types for us, which is very cool. I'm gonna have to read into this a little bit more later, but basically my assumption is that there's always a type for the various operations that you might do, like selecting, updating, and stuff like that. So we'll hopefully learn about that a little bit more later. Looks like there's also a create many API, so that'll be great for a bulk create if you have that in your API. But anyways, so we've got that. We've got the create created now. So let's go ahead and go back to our Thunder client and create a post request, which I assume should be able to take in a JSON that has a title. What do we want to call this? Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So let's hit send on this post/books with a title Harry Potter. I'll just call it Harry Potter 1. Hit send, and looks like we got a 201 created and a book that has that title and ID 1. Let's do another one. Let's do Harry Potter 2. Hit send. Harry Potter 3. Hit send. So now I expect that we should have 3 Harry Potter books. So if we go back to our get and hit send here, now we've got our 3 books. Pretty simple, right? And then remember that we added find one, so let's go ahead and try that. We should be able to do book/1, and that gets me Harry Potter/1, book/3, that gets me Harry Potter 3. So that works great. Looking at the documentation, I actually can also replace this type here if I wanted to be Prisma books unique, where unique input, which is actually equivalent to the shape of this object. So let's rename this ID to book where unique input, which is kind of a mouthful, but copy and paste that, and we should be able to replace this entire object. And from my understanding, that's equivalent. Very cool. All right, so if we drill down into that type, it is just that object with an ID number. So that is very, very cool. Again, kind of just simplifies the overall syntax. I guess it depends how much abstraction you want there. I thought that the original thing we had where ID is still very simple and intuitive to me, but I guess it depends on your personal preference. All right, let's see if we can implement update. So according to the Prisma documentation, to do an update, you sort of do .update, and then there is a where clause, and then the data. So that's a very simple, easy to understand API. What I wonder about is, do I also have generated types for these things? I'm assuming there is. Just doing a quick look through as well, you can do update multiple, so bulk update, I guess it's also possible. That's nice. And looks like they also have upsert, which is sort of a fusion between update and insert. So like if it notices that it's not already there, it'll auto insert it. All right, so to implement this, again, from NestJS, remember, usually you have to create your own DTOs. So you'd have, a create DTO, you'd have an update DTO, but we just learned that it seems like Prisma creates types for those automatically, which is super nice. So I assume that I should be able to replace this update DTO with something similar. Before we update that, we know that what we need to eventually call is this as prisma.books.update. And from the syntax, it said that we need to pass in an object that has data and a where clause, right? And we just learned that this type represents that where object, that where clause. So we should be able to reuse this type. So I can maybe do an update here. We'll do a where, and it has the type of Prisma books unique input, and I should be able to just do that, right? And then similarly, there should be a generated type for the DTO. So I think this should just be Prisma dot books. And the nice thing here is it looks like even if you don't know which one you're supposed to use, as you type it out, right, you'll get some pretty good intelligence because it has those generated type definitions. So I'm trying to update. So we're going to do books update, and I think we're going to do books update input here. So again, if we kind of take a look at that, right, if we look at what's inside the type definitions, it's just the title, because that's all our book model has. So just to kind of follow along and make this simple, let's call this data, and I should be able to replace this. All right, so I think that's all we need to do here. Now the problem though is because we've changed the shape of the inputs, we also need to update our controller to map to that correctly. So if we go to our books controller, notice that we've got a patch method here on /id, and it's able to take in the ID via the params and then the body from the request body. So we need to update the shape of this to, so I think the one update I need to make here is this really should be an object like that. And I just realized we actually made the same exact mistake in our find one here earlier, so we need to fix that. So I think when we tested that earlier, that was still running the, the previous server. So I should be able to do get by one, get ID 3. So that's still working good. All right, so we now should be able to do an update, right? So if we were to do a patch on book/3, I should be able to update this to a new title, perhaps Lord of the Rings 1. Hit send. We got a 200 OK. And if we go back to our get by ID /3, returns that same object. Go back to /books, and you'll notice that it's now updated. So our update works great. So just kind of impressions here. I think the generated types are definitely very nice because it seems like you no longer have to create DTOs from scratch. However, what I don't understand though is what do we do about validation? So doing a search for validation on Prisma itself doesn't seem to do validation. I mean, of course, when you run it against a database, it's going to check for the various constraints that you have, like if, things are unique and stuff like that. But it doesn't have the typical validation that you might do on the request body. So for example, min and max length or something like that. Unless I'm missing it in the documentation, about it, let me know in the comments. But I don't see anything about, just your basic request body validation. So I kind of anticipate that what that means for NestJS is that you likely still need to create DTOs anyways, and you use class validator like you've seen in my other tutorials to run validations off of that, and then you're going to have to map the DTO to the Prisma schema of basically these types, right? The Prisma update input, right? So I probably could have just replaced this type here with Prisma book update input, but again, how do you add validation to that? So that class still needs to exist, I think, right? So notice that this DTO just extends create book DTO. So if I wanted to, for example, add validation in here, so I won't cover it in this video, but you'll know from my other videos that you can use class validator to add decorators on the DTOs. So that will add you, for example, things like, is a string a certain format? Is there a min and max length? Is it not empty? Is it optional? Stuff like that. That's my assumption right now, unless I'm missing something. Let me know in the comments. But my assumption is that the generated types doesn't exactly replace your DTOs, at least in NestJS, right? So that doesn't completely eliminate these classes. So that would be one pain point that I can anticipate, not just in NestJS, but in any framework, right, where you do have validation. And usually with validation, it's represented through some form of schema, right? So you might be familiar with Joy or class validator, as I just talked about. So what that means is likely you're going to have to have a second representation of the schema that does your validation. So one potential minor pain point that some people will have. Anyways, let's just keep going here and finish up the delete. So again, I think I can do the same thing here with the controller, pass in the ID as an object. My remove here will probably be similar to this input, and we're gonna do this dot prisma dot books dot, I assume there must be a remove or perhaps a delete. There we go, delete, and I bet that just takes in a where, and I think we should be good to go. So let's go back to our Thunder client. Again, we got books 1, 2, 3. Let's try to remove books with the ID 3. So let's do a delete, hit send. We got a 200 OK. We get back the book that got deleted. And if we do a get again on /books, I expect that there's only 2 books in there. And there we go. Very simple, very intuitive. All right, so that's obviously a pretty simple example. Let's make this a little bit more complex by adding relations. So I'm going to kill my application here, and we're going to go ahead and do something similar where we do nest generate resource, and we'll call this authors. And we'll do REST API. We'll do the same thing, generate CRUD endpoints. And so that's similarly going to create for us a new authors folder. And actually, I forgot to mention this earlier, is we don't need this entities folder. Usually this would be the entity class that would represent your database table from other ORMs like TypeORM. In our case, the schema does that for us. It represents our database table, so we don't actually need this folder. You can move that to trash. Same thing here for books. All right, so that means we're going to have a similar thing where we have a CRUD set of CRUD endpoints for author, and we got an author service, and we'll similarly have the ability to do CRUD on that. But from Prisma's perspective, it doesn't yet know about this new entity. So I believe what we need to do is go back to our schema and our Prisma schema.prisma, and we need to create a new model in here, which is for authors. So I'm going to do model authors. And I think looking at the documentation, I believe the convention here is actually to make this singular author, and I should have done that for books as well. Probably should have called this just book. Well, we'll just keep that books, but just know, I think typically this will map to your database table name, and typically you want to use singular names for your database table. So just something to remember, a mistake that I made there, or not really a mistake, but more of a convention thing. So we're gonna have sort of similar where we need an auto incrementing ID and probably a name instead of a title. And then we're gonna say that an author has books, which is books with a syntax like this to represent a list. So something really interesting that I actually just discovered here, notice that we've got some missing things here. Like, it knows it's missing the schema side for the books, that it has an author. And I noticed that when I do format, it magically brings that in, and I don't know how, because why would formatting would update the schema? I don't understand that, but that's kind of cool, I guess. I guess it's maybe part of the extension that I had to add in the syntax highlighting. I'm not sure if that's part of the features that it has, but we'll make this lowercase a for author. But yeah, this is how you sort of represent, according to the documentation, relationships. So we're trying to do a sort of one-to-many. Author has one-to-many books, and a books has one author. What's not super clear to me is how does this represent that relationship, that it only has one author? I'm not sure. In other TypeORM, in other ORMs like TypeORM, you have like an explicit decorator for when something is many to many, or one to many, or one to one. Here it's not as obvious, so I'm curious to see how that differs in other situations. It looks like they do have some documentation on types of relations, so if you want to dig into it deeper yourself, go ahead and take a look. It does look like one interesting to notice immediately is that for many-to-many, you actually need to define 3 different models. You know, you need to have a model for your relationship table in that case. So that's something that's a little bit different to other ORMs. Like I think in TypeORM, it assumes that table for you. You don't have to manually define it. I don't think we're going to be able to cover that in this video. So maybe a topic for another video is Prisma relations. But let's keep going here. So I've updated my model. So my expectation is that I now need to rerun my migration. So I need to do npx prisma migrate dev -- name. I'll do add author. Hit enter there. And similarly, it says that it ran migration, it created the migration SQL, and my database is now in sync. Let's take a look at what that migration looks like. So I've got the add author directory here, migration.sql, and it created my author table. And then interestingly, the way it added that new constraint is actually creating a new table, moving the data over, dropping a table, and then renaming it back to books, which is kind of odd. I think in other ORMs, the generated SQL would be something like add a column and then, you know, assign the foreign key references, etc. So anyways, I don't think it's a big deal, but just kind of interesting. So my expectation now is that I have an updated database that has my new schema, but I also need to update my Prisma client. So back in the terminal, I'm just going to run Prisma generate, and it says my command was not found. Let's do Prisma generate. All right, so that's just something to be aware of, is you probably want to go through npx because you don't have that globally installed. Let's take a look. Let's run our application and see if that client got updated. npm run start dev. All right, so notice that when we do a get on /books, it now has author ID on it. So it's obviously working off of that new updated schema. Now in the author service, I want to make sure to also add in the Prisma service in here, right? So make sure that's imported. And then similarly, we're going to want to add Prisma service in our providers in the module. From NestJS specifically, you might want to create a specific module that has the Prisma service in it so that you just use that module as an import everywhere. That's probably what I would do in a more realistic situation. But for now, we'll just keep it simple and add Prisma services provider for each one of these modules. So with that being there, we should now be able to actually utilize this Prisma service. So for example, I think we should just be able to do something similar where we do this Prisma dot, and I expect that there is now an author field here that can do find many just like before. All right, so just doing a quick test. If I do a get on /authors, we get back an empty array. So that's working similarly to before. Now what I want to be able to do is to be able to add a book along with the author so that we can kind of query books with their author. So I want to figure out how to do that. All right, so back in the book service, if I were to allow creating a book along with the author, I can imagine that there's 2 different ways to do it. One is that my data would have both the title and the author ID, right? So it would look something like this, right? So you might have an object that looks like that. And it looks like, so just taking a look at, I was exploring the type definition for the updated books grade input, which now incorporates author because the schema and the type definition got updated. You'll notice that this doesn't actually allow for that shape. So you can't pass in the author ID through this type. From my understanding, I guess you have to use books unchecked create input. And I'm not actually sure what they mean by unchecked. Well, like, what is the definition of that? If I do a search on their documentation for unchecked, it doesn't really return much of explaining that. And it's also not mentioned in this advanced, type definitions, generated types. So not super clear about what that means. If you have an idea, maybe let me know in the comments. So my assumption right now is if I were to do that kind of insert, assuming that perhaps the author is already created, so remember we have our own author CRUD that we haven't fully implemented, but if we were to fully implement it, that means we can also create authors, and then once authors are created, you should be able to also insert books with that created author. So that's the way that you would do it this way. You'd have to update the type here to be this uncheck create input, right? So let's go ahead and give that a shot. So obviously I need to actually create my author create implementation here, which is just going to be the similar thing of prisma.author.create, and we need to update this to be prisma.author create input, which will accept a required name, and we'll pass that into our create here, or actually that should be in data. All right, so let's try to create a new author through our Thunder client here. So right now we have no authors. We're going to try and do a post on/authors with a request body that has a name. Let's do J.K. Rowling. Spell that right. Hit send. And I actually have an error here. I forgot to update my controller. So my authors controller. So I need to actually update the type here to be that same Prisma generated author create input, and I'll make it happy. Nest found 0 errors and is now running. So back to our authors. We're going to do a post with a body named J.K. Rowling, and we'll hit a send. And we got 2 uncreated, ID 1, just like before. So now my expectation is that I should be able to create a new book with title, let's do Harry Potter 4. What are we up to now? And then I should be able to add author ID here if I did things correctly, and that should be 1. Right, so let's hit a send. 201 created. We've got Harry Potter 4 author ID 1. So that works perfectly. Let's do a get on/books, and that's there as well. All right, so we technically just figured out how to relate an existing entity to another entity, really just, utilizing IDs. So that should be pretty typical for any database, right? Taking a look at the documentation, there is also a way to do nested writes. So that's another option that you can do. And I think this is where you would use that original type, which is where you would pass in an object that has create in it. And then that's how you would be able to add, for example, a new book and author at the same time if you wanted your API to do that. So, there is a possibility to write both of those at the same time and do the relation automatically. So, don't think I'm going to cover that here, but it's good to know about. Now, what I do want to cover is the ability to include the author when you make the books call. So how do we do something like that? It looks like what I can do is pass in some arguments in here according to the documentation that I can do include, and then this would define relations. So author, and we'll do true here. Now back to our get/books. If we were to hit send again here, it actually includes the author in there now, so that's kind of nice. So that's how you would do joins, I guess. This API is actually pretty similar to something like TypeORM, where you would have like a relations array. In this case, I guess you add in an object, a map of properties and booleans. So looking at the documentation, what sort of immediately confused me at first is I thought that the boolean here represents whether or not it's included. That's not actually true. If you provide a true value here according to the documentation, it looks like that just signals that it should include all properties. So for example, it looks like if we just wanted to select the author's name, I think I'm supposed to configure it like this. We do a select object and then we do name true. And what that does when I hit send here, it looks like, there's that limiting. And there's a couple gotchas here in the documentation that you probably will want to read into more if you're looking to use Prisma. So for example, it talks about a couple different things of, you can't do a partial select of the main entity and also a partial select of the relation. You kind of have to do it this way through the select. So a bunch of little gotchas that you just kind of need to be aware of, I guess. Not super intuitive, but I think that's just part of the slight learning curve of the newer API. And in general, it looks like there's a bunch of other things that you can do. You can do all sorts of where clauses, different constraints, different ways to include. It looks like here they have an example where they include posts where it's only include the published posts. So lots of things that you can do here. I think I'm gonna need to play around with it more to see, like, is this API able to represent all of the typical SQL queries that you would have to do. Not sure yet at this point. I'd have to spend more time with it. I do have to say they have really good documentation, right? So like, they have stuff here on pagination. I mean, doing a quick glance at the syntax, you'll notice that it's actually very similar to TypeORM's find API. If you've ever used that, they have that same exact, well, not the same exact, but a very similar find API where you can pass in some kind of configuration object that has, selects, wheres, and relations, or in this case they call it include. Pagination, same thing, right? So I have the TypeORM as an example documentation here. Find options, you'll notice that it has that same similar syntax of .find and then some kind of configuration object where you can do selects, you can do relations, you can do joins, you can do where clauses. So very, very similar API. So I guess if I can kind of wrap up my thoughts here, and we've got a fairly semi-working API. We've been able to do CRUD and we'll be able to do relations. We've been able to query those relations. There's obviously a lot more to go over here. There's so much to go over that I can't really cover everything. So I think I'll conclude my code portion of this video here and kind of want to segue into my impressions. So, I just tried it out for the first time. This is not a scripted video. The first time I tried it, what are my concluding first impressions? One is that it seems fairly intuitive. At least I think because I'm coming from a TypeORM background, again, the find API is kind of similar. It feels like it's not completely new. The documentation looks great. It's probably some of the best ORM documentations I've ever seen. It's definitely working at a slightly higher abstraction, obviously. So you'll notice that there's stuff in here where they have a full text search API for Postgres databases, and if you look into it, they have this sort of format to do matching. So it's kind of a specific format. I don't think this is a specific syntax for Postgres that I know of, because I'm more familiar with using the SQL like operator, where you'd use that with a where clause. That's what I'm familiar with when you're doing text searching. So I'm curious to see what the motivation was behind this kind of syntax over here. And obviously that's just one minor thing. There's a bunch of other stuff in here. So at a glance, is it something that I would replace TypeORM with? Maybe if I learn a little bit more about it and see what other benefits it has. But at least my impressions here is that I don't see anything super new. So as an example, one thing that I noticed in documentation here, under is Prisma and ORM. I remember reading something in here where they talk about something, the pain points with ORMs is that they're claiming is that you have this, you write migrations, you run your migrations, and then you update your models. Whereas they're trying to promote, Prisma's trying to promote their own way of you update the schema and then you auto generate and run migrations off of that. You can do the same thing, the same exact thing in TypeORM. In fact, that's actually one of the features that I really like about TypeORM is that in TypeORM you have this ability to automatically generate migrations from your schema. So it's kind of the same exact thing where in TypeORM you would create your schema through classes, and then the CLI for TypeORM would look at those entity classes and auto-generate the migration from that. So similarly, you have TypeORM use the entity classes or the schema as the source of truth, which is the same exact thing that Prisma is trying to do. So I don't see the immediate benefit. And one of the things with the Prisma schema is that it's introducing a new syntax, a new schema syntax. I guess it's very similar, or even maybe the same, I'm not sure, as like GraphQL. It looks pretty similar, but at least if you're writing in NestJS, for example, it introduces that new schema file that you have to maintain that is syntactically different from everything else in the code. Whereas in TypeORM, you'll just be creating entity classes with very similar decorators that you see everywhere else in the framework. So I think for NestJS, TypeORM still, at least a quick glance here, fits a little bit better in that ecosystem. But I mean, as you can see though, one of the things that we've noticed here is that the integration was very simple and easy. I did not run into very many problems. Only thing is you have to keep calling, Prisma generate every time you update the schema. You want to update the client. I think I read somewhere that there is a watch command so that it'll automatically watch for changes and automatically update your Prisma client, but I haven't seen that in the documentation yet. So just wrapping up my thoughts here, is it the next generation ORM? I'm not convinced yet. I think I need to play around with it more and see, what really makes this ORM unique. And again, like I mentioned, at least a lot of what we've seen in this run through is things that I've already seen in TypeORM, so it's not completely new to me. Although lots of definitely interesting features like the auto-generated Prisma client that is completely aware of the types and the schema. So that definitely edges out, I think, TypeORM. Like if you really care about type safety, that's a super cool feature. And I didn't get a chance to cover it, but you can actually also do npx Prisma Studio, which opens up a client, like a database client like this, so you can visually see your database tables. It's pretty basic. There's a lot better tools to do this, like dbeaver or db visualizer or MySQL Workbench, pgadmins, etc. So it's a pretty simplistic database viewer that I feel like most people probably wouldn't really use other than just to see the data quickly. I'm not yet super convinced that the separate schema that's using a completely different syntax from the rest of your TypeScript CRUD is a positive. But again, the fact that it's able to auto-generate migrations and the client off of that is super cool. That definitely is sort of next generation feature. I thought that the migrations were very easy. It's simple to understand. What I'm curious about is it going to be able to represent very complex relationships in a schema? I think I'll just need to try it out to find out. And also it does, again, like it played well with NestJS, and I can imagine it can easily play well with anything else. So it was pretty simple to set up. So just to conclude, I really like this. I think I'm going to explore this further. I'm going to learn more about it. And I'll probably make a crash course once I've really sort of internalized the benefits and the features. And if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments. And also let me know what you think of Prisma. Is it something that you think you'll be using? And was this format of a video something that you found useful? Me kind of walking through it as I'm learning it. So a little bit of a different tutorial format. Not really a tutorial, it's more of just watch me learn something. Anyways, I think this video is probably already too long. Let's go ahead and conclude here. And again, any feedback you want to let me know in the comments, go ahead, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.